This lecture is covering macronutrients for your course. I'm Professor Joanne Lind. If you communicate with me, my email address is at the end. Please call me Jo. So the learning objectives that we're going to cover today are to describe the structure and function of macronutrients required to maintain optimal health. And we're also going to explain the food sources of macronutrients in a healthy human diet. There's a second follow-up video that will focus on micronutrients for both of these learning objectives. So to get started, we're talking here about energy. We're talking about what the body needs to take in as fuel to be able to operate. And that comes down to the body's ability to make energy, and that energy we usually talk about in the form of ATP. So here's an image of ATP, and the energy in ATP is actually stored in these covalent bonds here between the phosphates. So that holds a lot of energy, so that when that needs to react with something, the energy is released and transferred to the place that the energy is required. So if we have a look here, basically everything we talk about in terms of food and creating energy, what we're ultimately trying to do is create ATP. So in humans, there are different formulas that can show you how your energy intake will relate to your overall ability to store or your needs for energy. So we can talk about it in simple terms: energy in, which is how much you eat and the food that goes in, equals how much you expend, so your daily energy output, plus how much those energy stores change. Now there's three scenarios that we can think about. One in which how much you eat is completely balanced with how much you expend, in which case your energy stores don't change. Now that would be the case of an individual whose weight does not change from one day to the next, or more likely from 1 week to the next. They have a stable weight because their energy in equals their energy out. If your energy intake, so the amount of food you eat, is greater than how much energy you expend, then you are increasing your energy stores. And how we store energy is in the form of fat. So if you're a member of this equation, it would mean that you're putting on weight or gaining weight. And I know we think of that as always being a bad thing, but it's not always a bad thing. There are some patients in hospital who are underweight, and we actually need them to be in this category of equation where we want them to take in a lot more energy than they're expending because we need them to put on weight. The final one is where your energy intake is less than your energy expenditure. And now this would be when you're trying to lose weight, or if you're dieting. It also happens when you're sick. So you might not be eating as much, or the disease that you have might be using up a lot of energy, and therefore your stores are decreasing, and therefore you're losing weight. So in simplest terms, that's how we can view food in, energy out, relative to whether we're stable, increasing our fat stores, or decreasing our fat stores. So how do we measure this energy? So I said it is ATP, that is ultimately what we're creating, but the foods that we take in have energy in them. And in Australia, we measure that in joules. So 1 joule is the energy used when a mass of 1 kilogram is moved through 1 meter by a force of 1 newton. So it's very technical. It's not something that you particularly need to understand, other than to know that joule is the unit of energy measurement in Australia. Now I still teach you about calories, because if you have any resource that's American, they will talk calories. So 1 calorie is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of water by 1 degree Celsius from 14.5 degrees Celsius to 15.5 degrees Celsius. So a different measurement of energy, and they are equated to each other. So 1 kilocalorie equals 4.18 kilojoules. Now I'm saying kilo there because a joule is a very small measurement of energy, and a calorie is a very small measurement of energy. So we often actually talk about kilojoules and kilocalories. And if you're talking about kilocalories, it's usually calorie with a capital C. So the calories that you might hear people talk about, so a Tim Tam might have 80 calories, they're actually talking about 80 kilocalories. So from here on in, when I refer to the energy, it's either kilojoules, or when I say calories, I'm talking about kilocalories, which is 1,000 times the number of joules or 1,000 times the number of calories. The reason we're talking about energy in and energy out is that non-communicable diseases are now some of the leading causes of death around the world, and that includes obesity. So if you look at this world map, which was taken in 2015, you'll see that all the countries shown in red here have a very high prevalence of death from non-communicable diseases. And you can actually go to the website that's listed here. So if you go to this website, you'll be able to see and play around with the data and have a look at the different prevalence of communicable and non-communicable diseases in different countries around the world. I highly recommend that you do that. So, as I said, obesity is one of the causes because of its comorbidities, such as type 2 diabetes, and it increases risks of things like cancer and other non-communicable diseases. So it's important that we understand how energy imbalances occur in people so that you can ultimately help treat people when you become doctors about their diet and what they should and should not consume and how they can go about that. We're now going to talk about obesity. So I imagine you've all heard of the term obesity. Its definition is listed here on the slide for you, and the important part is it's anybody who has a body mass index or a BMI of over 30. And you can see that the person image here was actually on the first season of Australia's Biggest Loser, and this is when his name's Adro came into the show, obese as he was. Now I'm about to show you some historical data how obesity has increased in prevalence over the past 30 plus years. I'm going to show you American data, which I sourced from the CDC in the USA, which is the Center for Disease Control. Now, if you would like to have a look at it, you just need to go to the website listed here on this slide, and you'll be able to see it for yourself. But let's have a look. So let's begin. This is America back in 1985. You can look at the key here down the bottom where any state that's shown in white they don't have enough data for. Anything in light blue has a less than 10% prevalence of obesity, and anything between 10 and 14% prevalence of obesity is shown in a darker blue. So I'm just going to run through year by year, and you can see how the prevalence of obesity has changed over time. 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, 1994, 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. Now they changed the way they reported after this, so the slide image will change, but you'll still get the same picture. So 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. 2016. So if we come back to Adro here, you can see that during the time that he was on The Biggest Loser, he did indeed lose weight. And this is what over the next week we're aiming to train you as future doctors to be able to assist your patients with. So now let's look at the 3 macronutrients that make up a human diet. And they are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Now, each macronutrient gives us a different type of energy per gram of consumed macronutrient. So if we have a look at carbohydrates to start with, if you eat a gram of carbohydrate, it will give you 4 calories, or 4 kilocalories as mentioned before, which is equivalent of 16.7 kilojoules of energy. So that is a relatively accessible form of energy in the carbohydrates. Proteins are similar. If we look at the proteins, you will also get 4 calories per gram of protein, or 16.7 kilojoules. Now this is compared to fats. Fats have a lot greater energy stored in them. So per gram of fat that you consume, you'll actually get 9 calories per gram of that fat, which is equivalent to 37.6 kilojoules. So depending on how you balance your diet will depend on how much energy you are consuming from that food source, and that is dependent on the amount of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats in that bite that you're eating. So let's have a look at each of these. We'll start with carbohydrates. So the primary role of carbohydrates in our diet is to provide energy, like I've talked about. Now, in particular, our brain prefers to run on glucose as its energy source, glucose being a sugar and carbohydrates are sugars. So as mentioned, we get 17 kilojoules of energy per gram of carbohydrate, and that can be in the form of sugars, so monosaccharides or disaccharides. Now mono meaning 1, di meaning 2, and that's to do with how many glucose rings are in the sugar. Starch is also a carbohydrate, and we'll have a look at that, and that's many sugar rings joined together. And then fiber is the third source of carbohydrates. So let's start by looking at sugars. So sugars can be in the form of monosaccharides, so mono is a single ring form, like glucose, which is shown here on the top right-hand corner. Where disaccharides, so sucrose shown here, the double ring sugar, that must be broken down into 2 individual glucose units before it can be absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, sugars get absorbed very quickly into the bloodstream, and this is important in conditions like type 1 diabetes. If someone has expended more energy than the sugar that they've taken in, and they've given themselves the insulin dose, that helps mop up all those sugars from the blood. They can require immediate sugar, otherwise they would go into an overdose of insulin basically. So it's good that we can absorb sugars quickly into our bloodstream. So if we look at monosaccharides, this is the end product of all carbohydrate digestion. And in the next few videos that I'll present to you, we'll have a look at how we metabolize carbohydrates. But for the purposes of this slideshow, we're looking at the foods and the food sources for macronutrients. So fruits, certain roots, corn and honey is where you would expect to find glucose. And also we produce glucose as a product of starch digestion in the body. And we get glucose, fructose and galactose, all sugars. So you notice in common they all have the ose on the end. Now the disaccharides, the double ring sugars, are found in different types of food. So lactose, for example, in milk is a double ring sugar. Maltose, which you find in malt, again is a double ring sugar. So sugars are an important source of carbohydrate, and it's important for us to have maintenance of our blood sugar levels because our brain prefers to operate from sugars. Let's now look at starches. So these are polysaccharides, meaning many sugars. So these are complex carbohydrates. Now they're made up entirely of glucose units, so monomers, mono meaning one, and they're depicted here on this slide. If you look at the bottom row of the table in the shape of the different starches, you'll see a tiny circle that makes up the pattern. Each circle represents a glucose monomer. So your amylose is a spiral-shaped starch. Your amylopectin is a branching type starch. And then you've got glycogen, which is an extensively branched type starch. Now it's glycogen where we store our reserves of carbohydrates in the body, so in the liver, and we access these stores when our blood sugar levels are dropping. So we'll talk more about how we digest carbohydrates in a later video, but for now you need to understand what food sources we can find these starches in, and they include grains and different grain type products, things like root vegetables, for example potatoes. Now if you've ever cut up a potato on a chopping board, the residue that's left behind, you'll notice you call it starchy because it's your starch from that vegetable that's leaving a residue behind. Green bananas and other plants you would access to get your starches. If we move on to our third form of carbohydrate we're going to talk about, it's dietary fiber. Now this is the most complex form of carbohydrate. Now there's two types of fiber. There's those that are soluble and those that are insoluble. So if we have a look at different fibers, when we're talking about fiber, they're actually resistant to digestion and absorption in the small intestine. So your intestine goes from the small into the large. It's not until these fibers reach the large bowel or the large intestine that fermentation and breakdown occurs. And it's not actually our bodies that's doing that, it's our microbiome. So the microorganisms that we have in our guts help us break down these fibers. Now dietary fibers include polysaccharides, so those many sugars, as I said, oligosaccharides, which is a few sugars, so they've got more than two polymerizations in them. Lignans is the third one, and all of these complex sugars promote laxation, which means that it promotes you going to the toilet to do poo. It reduces your blood cholesterol, and it can help modulate your blood glucose. So if you have type 2 diabetes, for example, dietary fiber is good to include in your diet because it helps moderate those blood glucose levels and maintain a steady state. The second macronutrient we're going to talk about is protein. Now you would have heard about proteins in your introductory to human sciences, but we know about proteins, they're structured here, they're made up of individual amino acids. Now an amino acid is made up of an amino group, shown there in orange with the nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. It has a central carbon attached to a carboxyl group on the other side. Now what makes each amino acid unique is its R group. So that R in that green circle in the image can be as simple as 1 hydrogen all the way down to branched or circle ring structures, and that's what makes one amino acid different from the other. So our body needs protein to maintain and replace its tissues. Our tissues are made of protein. So dietary protein is very important, and it's a source of amino acids to synthesize our cellular proteins. So when we undergo DNA transcription and translation, we're making protein. In order to do that, we need amino acids. And we get amino acids from a few places. One is the breakdown of other proteins in our body, but importantly, we need new amino acids that we consume from foods that contain protein. We need it for our muscle, our connective tissue, and our skin. Now, animals cannot synthesize the amine group, which is the NH2 or the nitrogen-containing group shown there in the orange circle. So we need to consume that in our diet. So as mentioned, we can break down our ingested proteins into free amino acids. So that's the first thing that we would do when we consume protein. We break it down into amino acids, and then we can use it in metabolism. Now, we don't necessarily store excess protein. Now, while we can build up our muscles if we're exercising, so we can increase our protein mass in our body, if there's leftover amino acids, they're not stored as such. We would then break them down, and in another video I'll show you how we break down proteins for energy and how we excrete them from the body. So where do we access our proteins from our food? Now this diagram here shows us different foods with their different protein contents. In general, meat is the richest source of protein because it's made up of proteins like we would build and require proteins to maintain meat and muscle in our bodies. So meat is a fantastic source of protein. Dairy is another source high in protein, so milk, cheeses, yogurts are very good for protein. And then the non-animal products such as nuts and beans and legumes are very important for those individuals who are on a vegetarian or vegan diet, as you need to have protein in your diet, and therefore you need to make sure that your diet has foods that contain proteins. A few are listed here, but it wouldn't take you much to do a search for foods that contain proteins to understand what foods are high in proteins that you would need in your diet to ensure that you have enough protein. We're now on to our third and final macronutrient, which is fat. So fat, as mentioned earlier in the video, is a high source of energy. It's very good for people who are trying to gain weight, to build up their energy stores in their body. So it is the most concentrated form of energy. Now fats come in many forms. So we have fatty acids, triacylglycerol or triglycerides, they're the same thing, just different names. And then we need phospholipids as well. So lipid is another word for fat. Phospho is talking about phosphates. So we need phospholipids on our cells, and we'll have a look at that. And we also need cholesterol and sterols, which is a fat-based product. So if we have a look at fatty acids, we have our stearic acid. So you can see that they're a saturated fatty acid where there's every possible place that a hydrogen can be attached to the carbon chain it is. So that's what the saturated fats mean, that the chain of fatty acid is saturated with all the possible hydrogens that can attach to that chain. The next type is unsaturated. So this is where you have not every possible place a hydrogen can attach occupied. So there are some carbon chains that have double bonds, so they're not saturated with the hydrogens. So that means that these fats are a little bit more fluid because they're not completely stiff and saturated by hydrogens. If we have a look, and an example of that is oleic acid, so that's one double bond. If we now have a look at those with polyunsaturated, so these are those fatty acids that have more than one double bond in them, which makes them even more fluid. So they're polyunsaturated, so there's many places that they're not saturated. They're much more fluid and they're actually better for us. So there's linoleic acid, which has 2 double bonds, and arachidonic acid, which has 4 double bonds. So these fatty acids are important to us because they're healthier for us. The more saturated a fatty acid is, the more unhealthy it is for us. So if we have a look at where we can find these different fatty acids, so your saturated fatty acids can be found in milk, cream, butter, cheese, and different meats from most land animals. So we should minimize the amount of saturated fatty acids in our diet. Our unsaturated fats can be found in things like olives, peanut oils, and canola oil. So these are good oils that we can use, and it's healthier than the saturated fats. The polyunsaturated fats can be found in legumes and margarines and some nuts such as walnuts, small amounts of leafy vegetables and fishes. So fish oil is important as well because it's got polyunsaturated fats that are very good for us. So they're the fatty acids. If we now look at the triglycerides and phosphoglycerides, this is where you have tri meaning 3, so 3 fatty acid chains attached to a glycerol. So this chemically is most of the fats in foods that we consume are in this form, and those fatty acids can be all the same fatty acids attached to a glycerol, or they could be different fatty acids attached to the glycerol. It depends on the food that you're eating. Our phosphoglycerides are where we have 2 fatty acids attached to the glycerol and then a phosphoric acid attached to amino alcohol. So this is a major component of cell membranes, and the reason is that the fatty acids are hydrophobic, they don't like water, where the phosphoric acid is hydrophilic, it does like water. So it can create cell membranes by creating a nice inner bubble where the water is not allowed to go, the fatty acids don't like the water, but it can be free floating in the body in a place where the phosphoric acid allows it to swim through water because it does like water. Now these phosphoglycerides are found in things such as eggs and dairy and legumes and green leafy vegetables, as well as seafood. So these are important fats to have in our diet. So if we have a look at how these phosphoglycerides form a membrane, you can see in the image here now that it has the exterior, so the phospholipid component, so the polar head group likes water, so it sits on the outside. So if it's moving through the bloodstream, it can therefore be in the bloodstream because it's got things that will move through water, and it protects all those fatty acid chains inside the lipid bilayer, so inside the membrane, because water isn't liked in that region. Now finally, I wanted to show on this slide cholesterol. So this helps with fluidity of membranes. Now I know we often hear about people having high cholesterol and cholesterol being bad, but cholesterol is only bad if it's in too high a concentration in our body. We need to have cholesterols in our diet, and we need the cholesterol there because it actually gives membranes fluidity, meaning it gives it some bend and flexibility. Now we find cholesterol in egg yolks and milk and fatty cheeses and meat. Now that's important because we need to consume these so that we do have that fluidity in membranes. We also need it to have healthy skin as well. You need to have some fats in your diet and cholesterols in your diet to have a healthy diet. You just don't want to have excessive amounts of these things. So if we have a look at the cell membrane, what's important about that in terms of we consume these fats in the diet, we actually need to have this bilayer which helps allow cells to get things from the exterior of the cell into the inside of the cell, passing through that hydrophobic fatty acid layer so that just not anything can pass through a membrane. So you can see here in this picture the cholesterols are important in those membranes, it gives it the fluidity, but we also have other big proteins there that facilitate transport across membranes so that anything that has a membrane can't just have anything move across it. It's like a protective layer for our cells. So the last thing I wanted to talk about are the lipoproteins. So lipo talking about fats and proteins being proteins. So these are important. And why lipoproteins are important is they enable fats and cholesterols to move within our bloodstream, because our blood is predominantly a water-based component, and therefore we need to transport things through our blood And in doing that, we need to have things that are hydrophilic, that like water and are able to move through water. So if we have a look at this image here, we have chylomicrons, so that's the largest lipoprotein, and it actually transports anything that we consume as a fat and we digest. That's the first uptake into the bloodstream, is fat as a chylomicron, and it transports those lipids from intestines to elsewhere in the body. And when we look at how we metabolize fats, we'll go into that a little bit further in another video. We also have our different classifications of lipoproteins, which are our what we associate with cholesterols. So we have our VLDL, so our very low density lipoprotein. So these are produced in the liver and they transport fats that we've produced ourselves around the body. Now we don't want too many of VLDLs because they can build up in our arteries and over time cause a disease called atherosclerosis. You then have your intermediate density lipoproteins, so your IDLs, and they form from the degradation of the VLDL. So they, as you unpack your fats from inside these lipoproteins, they shrink in size. And so you can go from a VLDL to an IDL if you're transporting fats to places in the body that might be able to metabolize it. The next one is your LDL. So this is when your cholesterol content in the membrane is still higher than your triglyceride content. So your low density lipoproteins are smaller than the other two we've talked about, and it's defined by your cholesterol content being higher than the amount of fat inside that lipoprotein. So they're considered the bad cholesterols or the bad lipoproteins. We do have a good lipoprotein, so this is HDL, so high density lipoprotein, and I think of the H as standing for happy because we're happy if we have a lot of HDLs, and these are synthesized in the liver, and these differ from the other lipoproteins because they have a higher proportion of protein to cholesterol. So there's more protein to cholesterol than in those other lipoproteins that we've discussed. And if we have a look at HDL, they help remove some of the accumulated fats and lipoproteins from our arteries and our tissues and help metabolize them. So they're good because they help metabolize and remove the buildup of fats, where the others are depositing fats in places. So as a summary to this short video, we've talked about energy, and in Australia we talk about that as kilojoules. We've looked at non-communicable diseases such as obesity and how that's changed over time. And then we've looked at the macronutrients in a human diet, so carbohydrates, fats and proteins. And in each of these slides we had a look at where we source those macronutrients from different food sources. And if you want more, you can search for more. This is something that's relatively easy information that you can find. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me on my email address.